please remember to hit the like button and check to make sure you're subscribed. YouTube is booting everyone. Okay. As I said, I'll be discussing some things related to my previous clip on the house, which explored the idea that house and household amount to a critical cultural technology that we'll have to revive if we wish to hoist ourselves up out of the mire of disconnected social and familial atomization the West is currently suffering. The focus tonight is related to all of this, but I'll be looking at two closely related subjects. As I said, fostering and intergenerational dialogue. Just to recap, for those who might not have seen my clip on the house, I'd recommend all of you go check it out. It's up on this channel, and I discussed it further at some length also with Jared from The Great Order and Jason of No White Guilt over on the channel No White Guilt. So you can find more about it there. So two clips, one on No White Guilt, one here, both on the house. Why is the house so important? Well, as I said, I discussed it elsewhere in the first clip in the series available on this channel. But to recap it, the main point was the house is a tool, a piece of cultural technology, if you will, a tool that allows us to shape events across generations, to project our will, our aims, and our goals across time. House and household together are a more realistically attainable way of reinvigorating our culture and our social relations. Together, house and household offer us an institutional basis for change that's more accessible to each and every one of us than larger organizations like churches or NGOs or governments. And these larger organizations are things that we might not be able to as easily turn to our purposes, but we do have considerable control, more control than we have over really anything else in society when it comes to house and household. What I'm trying to say is that houses are things that each of us realistically within our power, have it within our power to establish. And by focusing our attention on realistic and attainable goals, we can regain a certain amount of control over our society. Oh, goddamn whiskey's good. Remember, if houses were not important, if families and the homes they occupy, if house and household were not critically important to the future of the West, then there wouldn't be so many powers working in concert to annihilate precisely these ancient building blocks of our culture. So much for our review of the previous clip. Now, let us turn to fostering and intergenerational dialogue, which I see as directly related to the whole topic of house and household that I have already discussed. We'll start with fostering, which of course denotes raising or rearing a child that is not by birth one's own. For many, this will bring to mind the adoption of disadvantaged children, from faraway lands, rescued with swollen bellies and surrounded by clouds of flies, but this is not what I'm concerned with here. Instead, I'll be focusing on fostering within existing communities, fostering undertaken to strengthen those communities and further tighten the close bonds between the families which those communities comprise. It should be obvious, I think, to anyone capable of thought, that when you have relationships tight enough that you'll allow others to foster your child at a certain age, you've actually got a community, and one that need not be one whit less individualistic for all that. Sometime back, I was listening to Millennial Woes talking to, who was it? Critical Condition, I think, a woman. And I think it was part of Millennial, if I'm not mistaken. And Woes mentioned that when you leave home and go to college or university, you feel like you're escaping your parents, when in reality, you're just finding a new set of parents, which fact is, of course, exploited. The point in that discussion was, again, if I remember it correctly, all about how the school acts as a mechanism for indoctrination. I agree with this, of course. I think, too, that it gives, it goes a good deal further, as I pointed out in my clip on how progressivism is weaponized adolescence. And in another clip, laying out my conviction that so-called social justice movements are intended to make people sick, which is to say mentally ill. Anyone who is interested can dig back through my content on the channel and find those clips. But there's another dimension of all of this that comes to mind here, and I think it is an important one. And it is the idea of foster parents, the idea of fostering a child. My main exposure to this idea, or the thing that really kicked this off, I should say, because I have read a bit about abandoned, exposed children who were adopted by the church in the medieval period, the Christian era, late antiquity, medieval, up into the the Renaissance, that period, actually up until the Enlightenment. I've also looked at Roman adoption and the rest, but my main exposure to this line of thinking I'm sharing here was through my research into the Circassians of the Caucasus. Their culture is definitely a little explored resource for those wishing to reconstruct any number of ancient Western traditions. In this context, the foster father among the Circassians is called an Atomization. Now, that's a Turkish term, and I heard that term from Circassians who are living in Turkey. It is very likely that, of course, there's some Adige, some Circassian, some terms in the Northwest Caucasian languages that are different. But for now, since Circassians use any number of Turkic words, we'll just go with Ataluk, which means something like a guardian or a tutor. And the relationships that are created between families that foster each other's children, they're known as milk brotherhood. Well, here in the US, we still have the practice of raising children of others, but it's usually restricted to close family, like when a mother or a father's parents raise their grandchild or grandchildren because the birth parents cannot do it, or because they've died, or they have a drug problem, or they've been sent to prison, or any number of these other sad possibilities. Or we go in the complete opposite direction, where children are adopted by people who have no relationship of any kind with the birth parents. Obviously, this really isn't the same sort of thing. It's not really what I'm talking about here. What I'm discussing is the practice of sending one's own child away for a time, and upon reaching a certain age, which varies, from one culture to another, of sending one's own child away to another family with whom one has a very close relationship. It's really a kind of second family or second parents. It's important to point out that the relationship is not one of surrogate parentage. So if we're talking about the Ataluk proper, the male guardian or mentor of one family to whom a closely allied family sends their child to be raised for a time, it's more like a special teaching relationship, and one that comes with a certain amount of distance, ensuring that the child is not spoiled, ensuring that the child is looked upon and raised and trained and educated by persons likely to be more objective than the birth parents. It's a big thing to bear in mind. What we hope the child could be, what we fear the child might be, because we see it as a projected extension of ourselves. And of course, genetically, it is a projected extension of ourselves. Those hopes and fears can get in the way of a sort of crystalline, rational assessment of the child. Now, I'm not saying that all children should be treated in this way, that we should be, giving electroshock therapy to our children, like, taking B.F. Skinner's advice, or giving them away like Rousseau. They obviously need emotional support and attention. But what I'm trying to do here is underline the importance of having someone able to look with a little bit more objectivity at the child in order to make determinations about what might be best or worst for them. By that, I mean what kind of things should and shouldn't be done. Sorry, that was poorly phrased. So again, continuing with the example of the Atomization proper, it's important to remember that this is not a father-son relationship. There are things that are not possible with father-son relationships that are possible with voluntary relationships, with voluntary obligations of the sort that we're talking about. One does not choose one's own parents or one's children, unless you want to get into some weird ass, Tibetan Book of the Dead type shit, where the souls flutter down like moths towards a light as the beast with two backs, as it approaches orgasm, creates a kind of heated beacon that draws a soul through time and space to be sucked down and trapped into a womb and born. But happily, we don't have to go into all of that. We can leave that aside and say that for the most part, one doesn't choose one's parents or one's children. But some element of choice, some element of conscious intentionality is available in the practice of fostering that we're considering here. All this allows birth parents to choose to send their children to a person better suited, perhaps, than they themselves to address that child's particular deficiencies or encourage their own unique talents. Parents would have the choice, to take a simplistic example, to send a scholarly boy to scholars, or to send an athletic or a warlike boy to be reared and trained among warriors, or choose to balance these innate characteristics by raising warriors for a time among scholars, or scholars for a time among warriors. When you have relationships tight enough that you will allow others to foster your child, you've actually got a community, and one that nevertheless need not be any less individualistic. When it was undertaken consciously, the practice of fostering was doubtless used to increase the likelihood that a formidable individual would thereby be produced. But at the same time, that individual would have his or her sense of community reinforced. He or she would have lived and grown and learned with his or her foster family. But at the risk of being called an atomized, egotistical individualist, I will say it again, the creation of more complete, of more formidable individuals was definitely a primary aspect of all of this. Now, a child lacking in martial prowess could be sent to a family known for instilling just that virtue in its members, or rather than attempting to address a deficiency, a choice could be made to make the most of some notable talent in the child, kind of like I was talking about before. The child's family was already known for martial prowess. They would be ill-equipped to raise a son showing, for example, a great talent for hand craftsmanship, mastery in some craft. Rather than attempt to make a hawk out of a handsaw, the family could send him away to study under some master craftsman with whom the family had connections. Obviously, these examples could be endlessly multiplied, but I'm guessing you've glimpsed at least the outlines of the picture I'm trying to paint here, which could be illustrated just as well by reference to the Roman practice of adoption I mentioned before, common in the ancient world, as easily as it could be through reference to obscure social practices in the high Caucasus Mountains, with the example of this Ataluk among the Circassians. So as far as fostering goes, in summary, making choices of this sort in child rearing was clearly based on the desire to align nurture as much as possible with nature in the pursuit of individual excellence. But that excellence would in turn reflect back upon both the birth family and the foster family. And at the same time, it would engender, it has the potential to deepen existing social bonds among cooperating families or clans. It really rather nicely illustrates the way in which individual and collective spheres of life can be complementary. The two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Indeed, they shouldn't be. They should be intertwined. All of you collectivists can clap your hands. Since you've gotten an individualist to say good things about collectives and collectivism, all under the banner of cooperation, you understand me. Conscious and intentional effort that, yes, I said it. So the closest thing that we have now to put all this in perspective to any of this is boarding schools. And these, because they're quite expensive for the most part, are really only accessible to families that have a fair amount of money. And in any case, with boarding schools, instead of trusting those closest to your family to foster your children, they're instead sent to the state or to private institutions for indoctrination of various kinds, or to suck dust from the collectivist tit. In the interest of time, and to avoid any possibility that I'll drop dead from apoplexy in the middle of this live stream, we won't be going into the whole subject of public school. There is much more I could say about all of this, and maybe someday I will, but I'd like to turn now to the second topic. But before I do it, actually, let me just point out, for those who maybe didn't get it, why all of this stuff about fostering is closely related with house and household, obviously, is because you have to have a house and household and be allied with other houses and households in order for any of this to be possible. And as I said, such practices would tend to reinforce the identity of the house and household, both the one sending the child off and the one receiving it. The one sending the child off says, I will put my family's genetic future in your hands. I will allow you to take care of my child because that's how much I trust you. And in return, the family that takes it, reaffirms and reciprocates with these bonds of trusts and builds this stronger relationship over time. But they can also become famed. It could be, did you hear that so-and-so is so famous for his equestrian skills and horsemanship that all the finest families send their children there to become riders? Everyone gains in status and renown. Now, this is stuff that I wanted to talk about when I was first talking about houses, but I had to go through all the stuff that I did in those previous household clips in order for any of this that I'm now talking about, which is kind of secondary and contingent. Otherwise, none of what I'm talking about now would make sense. So now let me turn to the second topic, also related to my previous discussions of house and household, and that is intergenerational dialogue. To put that into simpler terms, for those of you who might be struggling with it, it means old people talking to fucking young people. And we don't do that very much in the United States anymore. Families are kept separate and apart. They wander across the country like tumbleweeds or dust balls of lint and cat hair, driven by the winds of this or that company offering a better or worse salary, or the quality of schools or property taxes. And when people do get old, when the old people would, under normal circumstances, be hanging out with the children of their children, helping to shape and ensure continuity of the family's knowledge, they'd be on the front porch, rocking in the chair and smoking a church warden while watching the children play and telling stories or whatever it is. I realize I'm idealizing it. It's not always that nice, but it could be that way. And we don't have it anymore. It no longer happens for the most part. What happens is our elderly get sent away to repulsive death holes where people who are misnamed caregivers rob them and lie to them and mistreat them and then put a bright face on it, kind of like when a warden welcomes politicians to tour the prison. The family day at the home is when they'll change the water in the vases, take the dead flowers out, mop the shit up off the floor, put the one or two crazy old people who are screaming down in some hole in the basement. Anyway, it's not always that bad, but very often it is. And that's where our elderly go instead of being around to talk to our young children. And there's more than that. We have the idea that these age cohorts, these generational cohorts, are not supposed to be speaking to each other. It's like, you see teenagers like, oh my God, why did that guy just come up and talk to us? Oh my God, what a loser. Why is he talking to us? All of this kind of crap. I don't know how kids talk these days, but that's how idiots talked when I was young. It's going on everywhere. They're not supposed to talk to each other. And so to kind of bring this around, we often, or too often, consider only the synchronic aspect of atomization, the atomization of individualism. Synchronic means at the same time. Yeah, you can figure that out. Synchronic, all occurring at the same time, distinct from diachronic, which is along the line of time. So synchronic is everything taken at a certain instant. Diachronic is sequentially across time. So we typically pay attention only to the synchronic aspect of atomization, the atomization we talk about as individualism. Synchronic atomization is the atomization we're all suffering from in relation to one another in any given moment. But what about the atomization arising from intergenerational dislocation? What about the atomization that happens along the line of time diachronically? What about the atomization that directly results from segregating generations, either indirectly through the destruction of families, or more directly through the idea of age cohorts with conflicting interests, like millennials versus so-called boomers? I get called a boomer all the time. I'm Gen X, fuck you. But anyway, you get the point. Anybody older is automatically a boomer, and if a boomer's ever good, you have to qualify it by saying based boomer or something, right? Conflicting interest, the idea of conflicting interest between age cohorts, and it's being pushed by the left. It's a major tool of those. It has to do with their whole idea of weaponized adolescence. Progressivism is weaponized adolescence, to hate and resent the generation that came before you, to want to destroy everything that they've done. It's a major aspect. Again, I've got a clip about it. It's called Progressivism is Weaponized Adolescence. And to take another example, look at the example of the Remainers in the UK, who are openly saying that they're just waiting for older voters to die. Can you imagine? Like, I'm going to break from my notes here. One of the most repulsive things I've ever experienced in my life, and it happened with a business partner of mine who came from the Northeast. He was from Massachusetts. Fucking Yankee. Not that there aren't good people in Massachusetts, but this guy, man, he was a piece of work. He talked about how his parents, his father was a physician, I think, was very successful, very bright guy. His son was very bright too, an excellent programmer, Java programmer. But he talked about when he went home and his father had some, famous paintings, I don't know, a Matisse or a Mondrian or some crap like that I'm not interested in, and had a few of these paintings. And they all sat at the table and argued over who was going to get what when the parents died. And I remember hearing about that, and I was like, that's repulsive. Like, that's disgusting, to sit at the table with your living parents and argue with your siblings over who gets what when the rest of them croak. It's beneath contempt. Now, imagine that on the level of whole generations in a culture. Whole generations in a culture who are willing to say, yeah, we're just waiting for the old ones to die so the revolution can continue. It's at that point that you realize just how black and rotten and vile all of this is. So all of this correlates with the new emphasis on disposable housing and multifamily housing. It also corresponds to the fashionable ideas so popular these days about how we're not supposed to take pride in what are called accidents of birth, how we're not supposed to be proud of things that we were just born with. Now, I get the point when people like Molyneux and the rest say, how could you be proud to be white? Or how could you be proud to, come from a family with wealth? It's not your accomplishment. You can't be proud of your ancestors, but you can admire them. I mean, I get the point, and there's considerable truth in it. But by the same token, there is a basis to be proud of your family's decisions and the things that typically we would say you were just born with. You shouldn't get out of hand with it. And I'm perfectly willing to accept that you could argue over whether or not proud is really the right word, or respectful and admiring. My point is that there is a basis where things that you are just born with are things that you can take pride in. Never mind, they always say that we're never supposed to take pride in things that you're just born with. But of course, these are the same people who think that we're supposed to suffer justly deserved pangs of guilt because of what our ancestors allegedly did. So the hypocrisy there is just fucking ridiculous. Don't you be proud of something that, you were just born with, like your race, or the fact that your ancestors built this country and that these immigrants came later. And yet definitely be guilty for what they did. It's just so fucking stupid. The point, however, is that each of us is a product of billions of instinctive actions and measured decisions that occurred across generations. We are the fruit, the loin fruit, quite literally, of our ancestors' choices. If a woman learns to listen to her intuitive heart, and these are the best kinds of women, if you got one who doesn't know how to listen to her intuition, you've got problems. But anyway, if a woman learns to listen to her intuitive heart and makes a decision based on that intuition to marry and reproduce with a man because, I don't know, because he quote unquote smells perfect, she's made a choice. Hasn't she contributed to my genetic makeup? My mother chose intuitively in certain ways to be with my father. Some of it was rational, some of it wasn't. But how she's built, what she comes from genetically, had to do with her sense of whether or not somebody would be a good fit. That's a kind of choice. And a sequence of such choices led to me and what I am. So how can we say that a individual's congenital virtues are unearned? I mean, I could see where you could argue that they're perhaps unearned by the child, but the parents worked hard for them, and all those previous generations worked hard for them. And so we could at least say, after a fashion, that the family, that the bloodline had earned these things. And as a family, therefore, they may justly take pride in them. Now, look at the way intergenerational dialogue has been torpedoed. There are all these things that moved through the family across time, the decisions of the previous generations, the ones that inform the subsequent generations. It's all been torpedoed. We're now formed into generational cohorts, generational identity groups. This whole business of calling one group the greatest generation, another one the baby boomers, and the next one Gen Xers, and the next one millennials and Gen Z, and all this. There were Gen Y was in there for a while, and they decided they liked millennials better. All of it's a bunch of bullshit. And what's really behind it, other than just base desire to lock people into marketing cohorts, which is what you get with listening to your music on the radio, and the Cool Young People channel has your music, so you're a cool young person, and then the music moves forward, and you're hearing Red Hot Chili Peppers, and that's now old people music, and then the really old people music is like Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, and the really old people music that I remember, but you guys are now too young for, is when you'd hear Big Band and Artie Shaw and this kind of shit. It's all just a way to lock people in to marketing groups. But what does that do for our culture? And I already pointed out the business of people being, in the UK, waiting for, the old people to die so that, they can, be sure to stay in the EU. It's fucked up. It's a way of bringing identity politics into our very generation. So what I'm getting at here, I'm sorry I'm winding all over the place, but as I started out, we've got synchronic atomization, which is the individualism at any given moment between the particles flying away from each other in what we falsely call a society. But there is also an atomization that occurs across generations, which is ripping us apart. Because I think about what happens when the granddad sits on the porch and tries to keep his dentures from falling out and laughs and plays with the little children, and they listen to stories. You've got a mechanism for continuity where the oldest are talking to the youngest, which is ensuring that whatever the parents gave, you've got this background generation that's also sharing that knowledge, and it all, I would want to say, chains together, but a better image because of the femininity of domestication, but also something that's more gentle about it when it works properly. It's braiding the knowledge, plating the knowledge of the family and plating together the knowledge and experiences of the various generations so that it forms a continuous chain. I'm mixing my metaphor. But instead, we have millennials are the victims of the boomers. So whether or not there's truth in millennials being victims of the boomers, and that's, not something I want to contest, especially given that I just discussed how earlier generations can earn things for us. Likewise, they can spoil and corrupt things for us. So I'm not arguing about that. Yes, there are things the boomers did that suck, and we pay the price for it. But my point here is simply that we can see how identity politics is being applied longitudinally, diachronically along the line of duration. We used to have very deep traditions that can be directly traced to biology, far deep and back beyond even mammals. Mark traditions, having a monogram on your towel is one of these. Monogram on your towel, scratching graffiti into a bathroom stall, having a household emblem that goes on the lintel above your door. All that goes back to animal territorial marking. Look at how family insignia were transmitted in pre-literate and semi-literate and even in literate periods. The youngest child would generally take a family's mark without modification. The firstborn would take the family's mark and add some secondary little feature to it. Now you can say, "Oh, Oliver, what the hell does that mean? Why are you talking about this?" Because it goes back to what I was saying before about reaching across generations. The firstborn takes their new mark. That means everything that the firstborn owns gets that new mark. Anybody who comes across, say you're a fisherman and you're the firstborn, and somebody's walking along the beach and you're out somewhere else, off in the bushes taking a leak, and while you're gone, they can see that your boat's there. Your boat, your oarlocks, your oars, your nets, your floats, your fishing gear, all that shit is going to be marked with your little family mark. And they can look at it and they can see, oh, that's the family mark of the such and such family, but it's got this little blip that shows that it's the new generation. So that's probably so-and-so's firstborn son. It has to do with property. These go on boundary stones. They can be marked on trees that have beehives or wood that you are allowed to harvest. It can be branded on cattle. And so the firstborn child has the modification of the old mark, and then, subsequent children will have their own little variations. Excuse me. Some of them being affected by marriage. So you marry into another family, maybe it's patrilineal mark. But what I'm trying to get at here is usually the youngest of the children will stay with the old parents as they get old, because they're the ones who are with the parents as they were the oldest. And they generally stay there because they're taking care of the parents as they get old. This isn't the old versions of society. And so what would happen? They would take the original mark without a modification. And what does that do? That ensures a kind of continuity, because the firstborn goes out, has a new mark, go west, young man, conquer, kick ass, take names, right? Next generation, maybe you go into the clergy, someone else becomes a merchant, but then there's, so-and-so who was born late, he was an accident, and, his aging mother really loved him a lot, and so he stayed with his old mother and father and took care of them when they were ill, and guess what happens? When they die, he keeps their immediate property, and he keeps their mark. And by keeping their mark, look what happened. The last child, which means the child who was born when the parents were the oldest, which means the biggest connection, the most expansive connection across time, because you've got the oldest person giving the mark to the youngest child, which kind of removes the potential static or noise in the signal. How am I going to say this? Hopefully some of you are following me. The idea, and I'm not saying this well, so it's not your fault. The idea is that by having the youngest child take the mark of the parents, when those parents at their oldest, first off, the parents are at their oldest, they've made all their mistakes on the younger children. They're at the height of their wisdom. Hopefully they're going to raise that child right. And in any case, whether they raise him right or wrong, they're going to do it with the maximum amount of knowledge that they've acquired. And that's going to connect that young child to the living memory of that previous generation. And so the mark gets passed on clean and clear. You know, the experience of these now older parents that they earned earlier in life and through raising all the previous children. They'd keep the original mark, pass it on to the child. The child would stay on the core land. The youngest would learn from his or her parents. Sure, to be the oldest, acting as a bridge to ensure continuity, like I said, while the older children, the firstborn and the like, instead, go off and make a name for themselves. So that's how we have that idea of continuity. And that relates directly to what I was talking about, with the grandma or the grandpa sitting on the porch with the rocker, looking at the little kids playing ball with grass stains on their knees and Kool-Aid mustaches, telling them stories of things, from far past. That's a continuity, but it goes away. It goes away when we drive the generations, we drive wedges between the generations and force them to despise one another. It's fucking horrifying. So I don't want to get too much into the marks and marking. It's just one example. And again, I'll grant you I didn't put it out there very well, but let's take another example of intergenerational dialogue. When I lived in Turkey, I would go out in the evenings and I'd go to some cafe to chill out and have a few beers with my friends. It'd be on the weekends. And I'd find myself at a table, and I was probably mid-20s at the time, and there'd be people in their mid-30s, mid-40s. Very often we were joined by my friend's father, who was in his late 50s, early 60s at the time. He's a very famous painter. And we're all around the table together. We're all hanging out, having drinks and talking. The older people would often go home a little bit sooner. They wouldn't stay up until 3 a.m, but they'd be out till 1 or 2 drinking and having fun. They didn't go to the dance club afterwards or whatever, but they'd be out and drinking and talking and shooting shit. And you'd be sitting there when you said, oh, that girl's kind of cute, and then your friend would be like, you should go talk to her. And then there'd be a 60-year-old guy sitting next to you. And that 60-year-old guy might be able to say something that would you just suddenly put everything into perspective and make you go, oh, wow, or maybe I should learn something. Or he'd say, that's stay away brand, son. I don't want to get involved in your business, but that thing right there is fur and fangs. We don't have that. That's the kind of intergenerational dialogue I'm talking about, not just on the front porch with the grandparents and the little kids. So you have the idea of shared advice. You have the idea of respect between the generations, and the idea that you aren't totally alien to one another, like that you're oil and water and should never be near one another. It's fucking ridiculous. And it's like the worm eating the roots of Yggdrasil. It's fucking destroying our culture, this whole idea of forcing the generations to fight each other. It's horrifying. And it's strange too, when you have something happen. When I was living in Turkey, I was really crazy in love. I mean, crazy in love. And it all fell apart. It was terrible. I mean, fucked me up terribly. And what was crazy, the one person, my younger friends had no idea what was going on with me. I mean, they're like, oh yeah, it seems like you're upset, man. You can just chill here at my place since you don't want to be back at your place with her. So, you can spend some time on your own here. Take as much time as you need, chill out. They didn't get it. My friend's dad in his 60s, he came over and he's like, what the hell happened? I'm like, He's like, yeah, I've seen it. I've done it before too. Listen, I know you're in a tight spot, and I heard from my son that you wanted to get your stuff out of that house. So I'm going to send my driver over, and he will be willing to help you. You've got the use of him for the entire day, and he'll take the car. In Turkey, when you want to move something out of the house, the roads are very narrow. You park the car for a minute to get shit, and neighbors start emptying ashtrays on your car and screaming at you because you're blocking the 1-lane road. It's a big pain in the ass, but he sent his dude with his truck, his vehicle, to help me. And that's the kind of thing that the younger person simply doesn't know, but an older person does. And again, you have a little bit of objectivity because there's a distance between you and him. He's not my dad. He can talk to me in ways maybe he can't talk to his own son. Not that I'm closer to him than his son or anything like that, but there are things that he can see and that he can freely talk to me about because of that distance. So this is the kind of thing I'm talking about with intergenerational dialogue. And of course, before we talked about intergenerational dialogue, I was also talking about fostering. And so why I wanted to talk about fostering and intergenerational dialogue is because, again, I had to lay out the stuff about houses first. But now that I've talked about house and household, now when you take a look at what I'm talking about here in terms of fostering milk brotherhood, intergenerational dialogue, extending the knowledge of the family as this trajectory across time, you can only really see the value in that if you have the foundation of the house and household stuff. And I wanted to talk about it because there is so much going on here. Everybody's, foaming and frothing, rightly in many cases, about so many abuses, about so many outrages, but there is so much that really is within our own power. So bringing it all the way back around, house and household is something we can change in a much more immediate sense by taking control over our own destiny, our family's destiny, and trying to lock in the strands across time and the various elements of the family. So fostering and intergenerational dialogue are, for the reasons just outlined, things of great interest to me that I think all of us should be thinking about. There is so much that is within our power that we don't really pay attention to, and so we let it slide by, and we continue to bitch about things that are not in our power, while ignoring the things that really are within our power to change, at least far more in our power to change than all these other things that we take exception to. So